welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. Our special guest is Dale Ahlquist, president of American Chesterton Society and also the publisher of the Gilbert magazine. Great to have you here, Dale.
Thank you.
Obviously, everybody knows you from being on EWTN since 2000 or so. You're on The Journey Home. You're on Mother's Show, and of course the series. What do we have up to number 6? Or
Yeah,
so?
we're almost up to number 6. Yes, we are.
Right, so
Six
that at
seasons.
least you finished taping those,
Yeah.
and so the whole series, and keep doing that. You've got books on tape. You've got books you've written, some of which we've talked about on the show.
Yes.
But we want to talk a little bit about the society itself, for the promotion of Chesterton and the magazine that goes with it. Now, this magazine, Gilbert Magazine, how long has this actually been published?
It's been published for 13 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you started it.
Well, I was part of the group that started it.
Okay.
I don't want to take full credit for it, but I'll be happy to take some credit for it.
Okay. Now, this magazine, is published what, 6 times a year? Is that what it is?
It's published 8 times a year, Doug. It's the world's only month-and-a-halfly.
Is that what it is?
Yes.
Really? And was that something you worked out on your own, or
Yeah,
was
that was hard to come up with that number. Yeah.
differentiation in the marketing of the
Right.
the
That made it
magazine?
a little more difficult for everyone to market it because it comes out every month and a half.
Well, let me ask you, what's the subscribership to this magazine?
We have about 2,400 subscribers, and a subscriber is a member of the American Chesterton Society.
Okay.
So you join, you get.
So if you join to get the magazine, is that
that's
part
right.
of it?
Right.
Now, it must be tough, though. I mean, obviously, magazines are not populating all over the world in this age of electronics. Print material, things like that are becoming more and more financially. There's some major news magazines that are, basically up for sale, etc. How do you make this work? Is it in context of the overall society and the overall experience of that?
To answer that question, I think the answer is it's a miracle that it works. There are some advantages still to a physical magazine in the hand, and one is that you can still roll up a physical magazine and hit a dog with it. You can't do that with an electronic media. So
But you might be charged with.
you could be
a
charged
battery
with
these
something.
days.
Yeah, there
PETA
is that
might be
too.
looking for you. Right.
That's true. Even hitting flies, you might be
That's
charged
right.
by PETA. But people still like the tactile experience of holding a magazine in their hand, of carrying it around, of reading it in certain circumstances where the computer is not available, and so the real magazine still serves an important function. But we don't know how it survives. That's the answer to your question.
Is it? Okay. But it's still surviving as we speak,
It is,
right?
it is, even as
Okay.
we speak.
Now, I'm just looking through in a table of contents, you have, it seems like, an incredible number of varied people contributing to this. How do you go about getting contributors? Are there regular, besides quoting Chesterton and yourself, are there regular contributors to the magazine,
Yes.
some of whom people would recognize?
I think Father James Shaw from Georgetown is probably our most well-known regular contributor, and he has been from day one, been contributing a regular column to it. A professor from University of Notre Dame, David Fagerberg, is a regular contributor. Nancy Brown, who's one of the popular bloggers in the Chesterton world, contributes a regular column. And we have a great columnist from Canada named David Beresford, who is a field biologist and a wonderful father of many children who writes with a great Canadian drollness. And he's been a regular contributor for years too.
Now is this magazine, because it is in English, and is the society kind of limited to English-speaking countries at this point in time?
We send the magazine all over the world. There are subscribers in probably 18 or 19 different countries, and we have some very faithful Spanish readers who are reading it in English.
Well, I was going to ask you, and I meant in all the times we've talked about Chesterton at different times, does he translate well?
Apparently he does. I've never read him in translation because I'm still trying to learn English, and if I can figure out English, I'm going to try to learn another language. But he has been translated into dozens of languages, and many of his books have been published in these languages. And he has a really large following throughout the Spanish-speaking world. In Argentina, he's considered more popular than even in America.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And why do you think that is?
Well, Chesterton is, even though he's a master of the English language, he's writing about universal truths. And I think in a Catholic culture, he's particularly accepted. But interestingly enough, Argentina, the example I just brought up, is a very literary culture. A very well-known Argentine writer who was not a Catholic, Jorge Luis Borges, he was always quoting Chesterton, and I think that's one of the reasons Chesterton's so popular in Argentina.
Well, it kind of fits because it's amazing to us, it has been amazing, that Mother Angelica, when we translated her into Spanish, it translates perfectly well.
Yeah.
Recently, Raymond's book was put into German, and we're doing some programs that are translated into German, and there's a great reaction.
Wow.
So like you said, that whole
Yeah.
idea of universal
Right.
truths that everybody can really
Yeah.
relate to. Now this magazine itself coming out 8 times a year. Now you're the publisher. Now there's an editor, Sean P. Daly?
Yes.
Okay. Now is he the one that decides what's going to go in the magazine, not go in the magazine? What besides, kind of being one of the people
Right.
who started it, what is your involvement on a regular basis?
There's actually 3 of us who work, 4 of us who put together every magazine, and so we're all 4 of us are involved in choosing the material, accepting it, approving it. I have the final say of what goes in, but I work closely with the others, and so we always have a couple of Chesterton essays. I always select those. There's a bunch of Chesterton quotations. I always select those. I always contribute an essay, but then Sean really he edits everything that goes in, and he has the control of how the magazine is put together. And then he has an assistant. Her name's Therese Warmus. She's the literary editor, and she's the stylist who makes sure that all the T's are dotted and all the I's are crossed. And
Now, are these people working full time on this, or are they freelancing?
They are part time, but they really work a lot on it. But we are actually all in 3 different cities, so it's all done through the computers. And then we have an art director in Scranton, Pennsylvania, so in the 4th city, and that's Ted Schlunderfritz, who makes the magazine look beautiful. He's a talented artist.
Now, have they ever turned down any of your articles?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
I'm sure they've said things about them, but yeah.
Well, they got published anyway.
Yeah.
Now, in the format, what is it you intend to do? I mean, in a sense, each time it comes out, the 8 times a year, what is your intention, format-wise, of the magazine?
Well, we sometimes have theme-based issues, but in any case, it's always, here is a Chestertonian view of the world. Chestertonian meaning the common sense, representing the Orthodox Catholic faith, representing the right view of the arts, the right view of politics, the right view of economics. So we cover everything, because Chesterton wrote about everything, and so we try to bring it all together. And we also are one of the only magazines that publish poems that rhyme, and we publish short stories, and we publish mystery stories. So it's a literary magazine as well.
Yeah, one of the things looking through this particular edition from early in 2010, earlier this year, I noticed there was a thing with our good friend Tom Howard, an interview with Thomas Howard, and so he's a big Chesterton fan then.
He is a big Chesterton fan and a wonderfully articulate man. He's just a joy to interview. I had a great time talking to him, and just a pure pleasure to talk to.
Because he had that Lewis connection.
Yes,
too.
yes.
He always had that interest in Lewis. And it's now, is this an interview that was done specifically for this edition, this magazine?
Yes, it was. Right. And so it was gracious of him to consent to the interview, but he talked about his interest in Chesterton. But of course, I probed him on his connection to C.S. Lewis, since he knew C.S. Lewis personally. So that was a lot of fun.
Right. Well, you would think he could, based on there's a picture there. I don't know who dug up this one. It's just wonderful, if you know Tom Howard, to see a picture of him as a young man there from looks like the 60s, at least from the garb. Now, when you're laying out a magazine like this, how far ahead do you have to lay it out in the sense of what you're planning to do each time?
Well, we know specifically certain elements that are going to be in it, and I think the main thing in the layout is getting all the elements that we know are going to be there, and then see, okay, how are we going to fill the holes, and that's where it gets interesting. Okay. So that we do that with art, with little Chesterton pieces, with quote blocks. And filling in the holes sometimes ends up being the most interesting thing in the magazine. All the Chesterton quotes are just great.
Yeah, you have quotes throughout, and also I noticed a decent amount of advertising. But one of the ones in this one I thought was interesting. Art for art's sake, and there's Oscar Wilde. I'm assuming with your audience they don't have a problem with Oscar Wilde. But some people have a problem with Oscar Wilde.
Well, yeah, just bringing him up at all could be controversial, but Chesterton deals with Oscar Wilde, which is so interesting.
What was his perspective?
He lived through the decadent 90s. That was the time when Chesterton was attending art school and very distressed by what was going on in the art world and the philosophy that it represented. And Chesterton was always a critic of art for art's sake, because art is supposed to be for God's sake. Art is supposed to be for something beyond itself. And so he just nails why art for art's sake is the wrong philosophy. But of course, that is the philosophy that took over for the arts. The arts just became a world unto themselves rather than serving a higher truth than themselves.
Now, I notice in this edition of Gilbert Magazine in the back, in one of the ads, there's something called the Chesterton Review, the journal of the G.K. Chesterton Institute for Faith and Culture at Seton Hall University. How is that connected?
Well, technically we're not connected. We are two different organizations, but we supplement each other's efforts and support one another. I'm on their board, for instance, and Father Ian Boyd is the editor of the Chesterton Review. It's a much more academic journal. We consider ourselves a more popular journal, and our goal is to popularize Chesterton. We want the regular reader to pick up Chesterton and start reading him and see how timely and how applicable he is to the world right now. And
based on the work you've done and what you've seen feedback-wise, and I would assume to some degree the exposure through EWTN,
yes.
Have you seen through Ignatius Press or other places an increase in interest in reading Chesterton?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and there's many ways that we can gauge that. I know that the television show has done a great deal to popularize Chesterton, just on my talks that I give around the country and people coming up to me and saying how much they like the show. And I never would have read Chesterton if I hadn't seen that show, and that's a great affirmation. But the fact that all these books of his have come back into print and that they are being bought and they are being read, that's 15 years ago, there were probably 10 of Chesterton's titles in print. And now there are over 70 of his books back in print. And now there are new titles, new collections of previously uncollected writings coming into print, and books about Chesterton coming into print. And now we're starting to see slowly from the academic world, which probably has been the last to catch on to this, interest at the academic level in Chesterton. It's coming more from students than from professors, but you see undergraduates wanting to do their senior thesis on Chesterton, graduate students at the master's and at the PhD level wanting to do dissertations on Chesterton. And that we did not see that a few years ago.
Right, with the interest being raised, has there also been any pushback against Chesterton? People who were, who didn't bother with him before, who now rise forward to criticize him?
Well, now that is interesting, and that's when you know that you're starting to make an impact, when people are actually starting to write and take the trouble to write articles against Chesterton. Then we know we are making an impact. And yes, there have been some articles in major publications against Chesterton. The New Yorker came out with an extended article about Chesterton that the first 2/3 of it are praising him, and you're starting to feel pretty good about it.
Right.
And then the last third of it is just an attack, a vile attack, calling him, a Jew hater.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and going that whole route. And we did a whole issue of the magazine, defending him against the charge of anti-Semitism. But it turned out what they were really against were his economic ideas. They were just using the anti-Semitism as kind of the front.
And what were it? Distributism?
Distributism. They were against this idea of supporting local economies. And the subtitle of the article was "The Dark Side of Localism." So that was really their agenda, which is very odd. Very odd.
Yeah, you would think on the surface they would like his ideas.
Yeah, you would.
But I guess if you're into kind of a central planning control kind of model, it's the exact opposite then, right?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the people who tend towards the left with their big government and socialist ideas, they don't like distributism. But our friends on the right,
the free marketeers,
they feel very threatened by distributors, and they shouldn't. They shouldn't, but they do.
Right. Now, speaking of that, and just his book. Now, you've got this magazine, and it's happening here in the United States, and you're sending it around the world. You've got the society here. Are there other societies throughout? Different ones, or are there chapters in various countries?
Well, first of all, we have lots of local Chesterton societies in the United States, and they're mostly ad hoc affairs. We don't control them.
So you don't have some official join chapters of
We haven't come to that
society?
yet,
Okay.
but what we do is encourage these local ones, and some of them are very well organized and very, very active. They are starting to put on their own conferences, some of these local
Okay.
Chesterton societies, and we have over 30 of them around the country.
And you put on conferences.
Yes, we put on a big national conference every summer, and people can find out about that at chesterton.org at our website. And those are always a lot of fun.
And what would happen if someone went to one of the conferences? What would it be like?
They have more fun than should be allowed, and yet it's all legal.
Legal
Yeah,
and-
it's all legal. But we have a lot of great talks on a wide variety from great speakers all around the country and around the world.
Are they all focused on Chesterton,
They-
obviously?
They have some element to connect to Chesterton, but there'll be a talk on Chesterton and Newman, on Chesterton and P.G. Woodhouse, on Chesterton and detective fiction, but also one on Frank Capra, the filmmaker,
right.
and on Alfred Hitchcock, the filmmaker, and shows
Both
that
Catholics,
Yeah,
right.
both Catholics, and turns out they both had a connection to G.K. Chesterton.
Oh, really? I
Yeah,
didn't know.
yeah.
Okay.
So things like that, a lot of fun stuff.
Right.
And then we do poetry, and we sing, and we drink, because that's a Catholic thing to do, and it's always a great time.
Do you do more singing after drinking?
Usually that helps the singing an awful
or-
lot. Yes.
But you don't notice it as much. When you're going and doing this magazine and you've got the society, is this something you do now full time?
Yes, Doug, I've done this full time now for 9 years. I've devoted myself to this, and I started the Chesterton Society and the magazine as just a thing on the side. It was a hobby. It was just something I felt would be interesting, and there was a need for it. I wanted to help revive interest in Chesterton. I was at a spiritual retreat one week, and I realized we're never going to accomplish anything unless I give myself full time.
Full time to it?
And the Lord has taken care of me since that day. So it's been a real blessing.
So you're kind of a lobbyist for Chesterton.
I guess you could say that.
That's
yeah.
how that kind of works. Okay. Now, as far as the series itself, there's been 5. This is 6th. You just finished taping. Now, each time, I'm assuming even with the magazine, you're trying to always kind of move it up one level, right?
Yeah, it's true. I don't know if we're trying to. It happens to
It's
move
happening
up
on
one
its own.
level. Yeah, because there's the deeper you get into Chesterton, the more profound he gets. And there is that connection that the more ideas you're trying to pull together, you see how they're connected to everything else. And we started with just very general overviews of Chesterton, and that was interesting, and people liked that. But now when we address specific ideas, it does get better. It gets richer, and that's why we are going higher in a way. Yeah.
Now, throughout this, you mentioned earlier about all the different quotes, and there's quotes right on the front. Jazz did not prevent me from thinking, even if it did prevent me from talking.
Here, I'll give you a couple quotes,
ahead.
Doug. Here's what we call the new ideas are generally broken fragments of the old ideas. A man can impose education without having it himself, but he cannot hand on tradition without having it himself. And
Let me ask you, in a sense of a quote, I mean, are there quotes out there that have been popularized that people don't realize are from Chesterton?
yes, there are. And then there's also some very famous quotes that are attributed to Chesterton that no one quite knows where they came from because they didn't come from
Oh,
Chesterton.
really? What would be an example? of something?
Well, the very famous one that we have finally done the full analysis of is when a man stops believing in God,
Right.
he doesn't believe in nothing, he believes in anything.
Anything, right.
That's always, Chesterton is his most quoted quote, and he didn't say it.
no.
But he said something very close, and we finally put it together as to why it's always attributed to Chesterton. And no one else said it. It just
So you think it was someone took that from him
yeah,
and adapted it
right.
slightly, or
he's the
misquoted
godfather
him?
of the quote.
Kind of
He's-
like
yeah.
Play It Again, Sam, was
Yeah,
never
yeah,
really said
right,
in,
right.
in Casablanca.
Another one is tolerance is the virtue of a man without convictions. That's a good quote.
Yeah.
And it's always attributed to G.K. Chesterton. He didn't quite say that. He said something that bigotry is the anger of a man with no convictions, with actually no religion.
Right, so somebody
yeah.
kind of adopted it, or
Right.
adapted it
yeah.
slightly, right.
Each word got changed and it ended up being something else.
What was the most surprising quote you ever read by him?
Oh, wow, that's a good one. Good question. Instead of answering that question, let me just one I just read. I just came upon it. It's a beautiful quote. Never had encountered it before. The reward of chastity is clear thinking. The reward of chastity is clear thinking. just stumbled upon that quote of his recently. I'm thinking, boy, if that doesn't define the problem with the modern world, we have an unchaste world and we don't think clearly.
Right.
Yeah.
And one follows the other.
Yeah, one falls the other. What interesting connection, isn't it? Yeah.
Now, are you planning on doing another series for us here at EWTN? or-
Well, Doug, I think I once said to you, we won't run out of material. We're willing to go as long as you are willing to go, and we haven't run out of material
Zero,
yet.
that's for sure, right.
So, let's talk when we run out of material. We haven't run out of material yet.
So there's still an opportunity. Well, let's talk about people who are out there saying, maybe I've started reading Chesterton, but I'm not sure where to start or where to jump in. What would you advise people to do besides reading your 2 books?
Well, I will say read my 2 books.
Okay.
But, this magazine, we've talked about this magazine. This is a really easy way to start reading Chesterton and getting used to his thinking and his writing, because you always have a couple of easy Chesterton essays in this one, timely, that probably are appearing for the first time in print in 80 or 90
Do you
years.
think sometimes people hear essay
Yeah.
and it kind of gives them a bad feeling and reminds them of school?
Essay is a scary word. It's
Yeah,
true.
kinda scary,
So we could
right?
say article if that
Okay,
helps.
that sounds
Yeah,
better.
We could say article.
Okay, right.
But then there are, of course, the quotations that we were just referring to. So the bite-sized nuggets of Chesterton. And you get a couple of those quotations, you start chewing on them, you like them, you start quoting them, and they always come back. They're always relevant. So this is a great way to be introduced to Chesterton. Is the magazine.
Right. And how would someone go about subscribing to the magazine?
Go to our website, chesterton.org, and it's
Have that up on the screen
right on the
for you?
front page.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
and or they can certainly call us at 952 831 3096.
Okay.
American Chesterton.
And
Society.
also you could find out about information about conferences, right?
Right, and all our information about our conferences. And after I mentioned the website itself is a good introduction to Chesterton. We have a lot of material on the website.
Right, and for people starting local groups, there's no packet or something like that a starter kit, right? That's really
we'll send
spontaneous
them
at
a
this
we'll
point.
send them a Chesterton beer mug to get them
Okay,
started.
to get them started.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me ask you, who did Chesterton read?
That's a good question. And I think it's really surprising who he considered one of his most influential literary influences, which was Charles Dickens.
Mm-hmm.
He was a big Charles Dickens fan. And really, what Chesterton did for Charles Dickens is what I'm trying to do for G.K. Chesterton.
Really? Okay.
Charles Dickens was forgotten by the time that Chesterton was writing about him. And he created a huge revival in Charles Dickens and point out to what an important writer he was. His affirmation of the common man and of common sense, the joy of life, and all the truths that he wrote about so beautifully. That's what really was very compelling to Chesterton. Shakespeare was a huge influence on Chesterton. The Robert Louis Stevenson, the adventure stories. He makes this great point, for instance, about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Everyone thinks, that's about good versus evil.
Right.
No, it's about what happens if you try to separate the conscience from the normal. So Mr. Hyde is evil, but Dr. Jekyll still can't forget about evil. He's still tormented by his conscience, whereas Mr. Hyde no longer has a conscience. You can never really separate the two, and it's a wonderful analysis. Shows how Chesterton will always give you a new insight that you hadn't thought of. So Chesterton, you don't see him being influenced by Catholic writers in particular.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, but yet they all are always pointing to the Catholic truth. Now, at some point, we think he read Thomas Aquinas because he wrote this great book on Thomas Aquinas.
Okay.
But Evelyn Waugh claims that Chesterton just picked up the Summa and ran his fingers over the bindings and absorbed everything that was in it. Yeah.
So what do you think?
I think he may have read
it?
some at some point.
Were there any writers in his time that he would have told people not to read?
Well,
Or was he very open and think all ideas are worthy of consideration?
what's so interesting about it is he'll pick up a book that he disagrees with, and he'll always start by saying, this very interesting and important book, he'll, brings out this, but where I part from the author or where I disagree, so he'll make some establishment of where there's a connection and why the book is worth reading, but then he'll also show where it has gone wrong. And he was, of course, his great opponents like H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw people who in many ways are not worth reading, but they're very popular. Chesterton will affirm what's good about them, but he'll also take them apart and
Well,
show the
Shaw was
weakness.
pretty witty.
Yeah, he's
He
got
was
the
very
witty,
witty.
and H.G. Wells is a great writer. He's a great writer, even though he's a bad thinker.
Right.
Yeah.
right. Well, that's so. Let's say, what would be upcoming? Would people look for in the magazine in the sense of topics, and how do you decide what topics it's going to be?
Well, it's funny because you can return to some of the same topics and find that they're even more. We have an education issue on a regular basis. And because education is always a hot topic, and we're always talking about how to fix that. Healthcare, interesting enough, is an issue that keeps coming up, and it comes up more and more.
More, right.
And Chesterton addresses it, and there's a Chesterton approach to that. So there'll be an issue
So
devoted
he
to
literally is timeless.
that. Yeah, timeless.
And we are just out of time. Thank you so much, Dale.
God bless you,
Great to
Doug.
have you here.
Thank you.
Dale Ahlquist, president of the American Chesterton Society and publisher of Gilbert Magazine. Check out their website to find out more about the society and how you can subscribe. I'm Doug Heck. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.